23 stabbings. It wasn't an execution. It was a ritual, a bloodbath in the marble heart of Rome. The man who believed himself a god, Gaius Julius Caesar, lay bleeding out at the feet of the statue of his greatest enemy, Pompey the Great. The irony is brutal. The assassin senator's men who had dined with him the night before raised their bloodied daggers. They didn't flee. They shouted. They called themselves the Liberators. They believed that on that day, the Ides of March in 44 BC, they had saved the Republic, that they had cut off the head of the serpent of tyranny. In their arrogance, they thought the people of Rome would take to the streets to cheer them, to thank them for restoring freedom. But the people did not acclaim them. The silence in the Forum was their first death sentence, a heavy, dense silence laden with fear. Not fear of the dead tyrant, but of them the men who had unleashed chaos. Why did the people they claimed to have saved receive them with dread and not with flowers? Because the average Roman didn't live in the senator's villas. They lived in harsh reality. And Caesar, the tyrant, had given them stability, victories, and bread. The Liberators, on the other hand, offered only an abstract idea of freedom and blood. The brain behind the plot. Gaius Cassius Longinus, a man consumed by personal resentment in the face. The symbol, Marcus Junius Brutus Caesar's adopted son, the man whose betrayal dealt the mortal wound. It's said that Caesar's last words upon seeing his face were not of anger, but of pained surprise. You too, my son. They believed they had won. They marched to the capital. They barricaded themselves, expecting the city to recognize them as the new fathers of the nation. They underestimated one man, a man who hadn't drawn a dagger, but whose words would be sharper than any steel. The consul, Mark Antony. And worse, they underestimated a ghost, a name. Hundreds of kilometers away in Apollonia, an 18-year-old youth, sickly and unknown, receives a letter. He's informed that his great-uncle, Julius Caesar, has been assassinated. But that's not the news that would change the world. The real bombshell is in the will. Caesar had adopted him as his son and primary heir. That boy, ignored by all, would become the embodiment of vengeance. He didn't inherit just Caesar's fortune, he inherited his name. And with that name, a blood oath. His name was Gaius Octavius. His arrival in Rome would mark the beginning of the end for each of the 60 men who plunged their steel into his adoptive father's body. They didn't know it yet, but they hadn't killed a man. They had unleashed two monsters, civil war and Octavian. The hunt was about to begin, and it wouldn't stop until the last of the Liberators paid their debt in blood. For a moment it seemed that blood wouldn't call for more blood. In a desperate move to avoid civil war, the Senate granted amnesty to the assassins, a fragile, tense pardon. Brutus and Cassius descended from the Capitol, believing they had weathered the storm. They even dined with Mark Antony in a truce as false as the smiles on their faces. They had control of the Senate. They had the daggers. They thought they had the power. Their mistake was allowing Caesar a state funeral. Brutus spoke first. His speech was a work of stoic logic. Cold, reasoned, philosophical. He appealed to virtue, duty, love for the Republic. He explained that he didn't kill Caesar out of hatred, but out of love for Rome. It wasn't that he loved Caesar less, but that he loved Rome more. The crowd, confused, nodded. They seemed to accept the terrible necessity of the act. The Liberators breathed a sigh of relief, but then Mark Antony ascended the rostra. He didn't shout, he didn't accuse. His voice was a whisper of pain that nonetheless reached every corner of the Forum. "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears," he began. "I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. He said that Brutus was an honorable man, that they all were. He repeated the phrase over and over, honorable men. And with each repetition, the word honorable rotted, turning into poison, into sarcasm as sharp as a razor. Then he bent down, lifting the toga that covered Caesar's body. The purple cloth, stiff with dried blood, revealed the 23 gashes. Look through here, entered Cassius's dagger. See what a rent the envious Casca made. And through this other, the well-beloved Brutus stabbed. He transformed a political assassination into a personal butchery. He made the crowd see not a tyrant, but a betrayed man. And then the coup de grace, he pulled out a roll of papyrus Julius Caesar's will. The crowd held their breath as Antony read that Caesar bequeathed his private gardens to the people of Rome to turn them into public parks forever. And then the finishing blow. Caesar left each Roman citizen, each man in that square, a sum of 75 drachmas. Hell broke loose. Brutus's logical speech vanished before pure emotion. The people's love for their murdered benefactor exploded in an uncontrollable wave of violence. They tore up the benches and tables from the forum to build an improvised funeral pyre for their hero right there. Then, with torches lit from that sacred fire, the mob turned into a pack of wolves. They no longer sought liberators. They sought murderers. Their first victim was an unfortunate poet named Gaius Helvius Cinna. They mistook him for one of the conspirators, Lucius Cornelius Cinna. His pleas didn't matter. It didn't matter that he screamed he was just a poet. They tore him limb from limb in the middle of the street. It was the first payment of the blood debt. Brutus, Cassius, and the others watched the flames from their homes. They saw the people they claimed to have liberated marching toward them with torches and knives. Their republican dream had turned into a nightmare. They had to flee Rome like thieves in the night. They were no longer senators. They were fugitives. And while they ran for their lives toward the east, the real danger, the young Octavian landed in southern Italy. He didn't bring an army. He brought something far more powerful, Caesar's name and a checkbook that soon seemed bottomless. And he was about to use both to buy the loyalty of Rome's deadliest weapon, his father's legions. While Rome burned and the assassins fled, Octavian played his own game, a chess match on a board of knives. Upon arriving in Rome, he presented himself to Mark Antony, the new master of the city. Antony saw him for what he was, a pale boy, inexperienced, a mere nuisance. He refused to hand over Caesar's fortune, using the money to consolidate his own power. It was a miscalculation that would cost him the world. They underestimated his name. Octavian began signing as Caesar Octavianus, a stroke of genius. To the people and the legions, he was Caesar. And when Antony denied him the money, Octavian did the unthinkable. He sold his own properties and those inherited from his family to pay the people the 75 drachmas promised in the will. He fulfilled his father's word. Overnight, the boy became the favorite of the plebs and, more importantly, of Caesar's veteran legions. Hardened men from 1,000 battles who had adored the general saw in this youth the reincarnation of their leader. Octavian didn't ask for their loyalty. He bought it with money promises and, above all, with the power of an immortal name. He stole the legions from Antony right under his nose. The tension erupted. The two avengers of Caesar declared war on each other. But while they fought in northern Italy, news arrived from the east, alarming news. Brutus and Cassius weren't wasting time. They had plundered the eastern provinces, amassing a gigantic war treasury. They had recruited and formed 19 legions, a formidable army, funded by extortion and ready to march on Italy. Antony and Octavian realized a terrifying truth. They hated Caesar's assassins more than they hated each other. They met on a small island in a river near Bologna. Antony Octavian and a third man, Lepidus, Caesar's general. There amid the mud and fog, these three men formed the second triumvirate. It wasn't an alliance, it was a predator's pact. They divided the world like spoils, and then to finance their war and eliminate their enemies at home, they unleashed terror. The proscriptions weren't a simple list of enemies. They were a public death sentence. Hundreds of senators and thousands of the wealthy class were declared enemies of the state. Their names written on plaster tablets were nailed to the forum. Anyone could kill them. Not only was it allowed, there was a reward. The killer received a share of the dead man's properties. The rest went to the triumvirate. Rome sank into bloody paranoia. Slaves murdered their masters to gain freedom. Sons betrayed fathers for inheritance. No one was safe. And on that list, Antony demanded one name. Above all, Marcus Tullius Cicero. Rome's greatest orator. Cicero wasn't one of the assassins, but his speeches against Antony had sentenced him. Octavian, who owed Cicero his political rise, agreed. He sacrificed him without blinking. Antony's assassins caught up with him near his villa. Cicero ordered his servants not to resist and offered his neck. They cut off his head and hands, the same hands that had written the speeches that so offended Antony. They brought them to Rome, and in an act of supreme barbarity, nailed them to the rostra, the platform from which Cicero had spoken so many times. Vengeance was total, with Rome purged and their coffers filled with the blood of their enemies. The triumvirate turned their gaze eastward. The purge was over. Now the war began. Brutus and Cassius weren't hiding. They had gathered in Greece with their 19 legions. The final confrontation that would decide the Republic's fate was inevitable. The end of the Roman world had converged on a plain in Greece called Philippi. It wasn't one army against another. It was one era against the next. On one side, Octavian and Antony with Caesar's name as their banner and vengeance as fuel. On the other, Brutus and Cassius with the dying idea of the Republic and the memory of a bloody dagger. More than 200,000 men, the greatest concentration of Roman military power history, had ever seen poised to annihilate each other. The Liberators' plan was cunning, dictated by Cassius's cold logic and experienced general. Their army was better supplied and controlled the sea. Their strategy wait. Avoid a pitched battle, let hunger and disease wear down the triumvir's legions. But Brutus wasn't a strategist. He was a philosopher turned general. He was tormented. It was said that in his camp, the omens were terrible. 2 eagles that followed their legions were replaced by crows and vultures in the day they arrived at Philippi. And legend tells that nights before the battle, a ghostly and terrible apparition appeared in his tent. "Who are you?" Brutus asked. The shadow replied, "I am your evil genius Brutus. We shall meet at Philippi." Was it Caesar's ghost, or the ghost of his own guilt, pressured by his impatient officers and haunted by his demons? Brutus imposed his will. They would force the battle. Cassius, against his better judgment, yielded. The first battle of Philippi was a chaos of blood and dust. On the right flank, Brutus's legions, with unstoppable fury, overran Octavian's, breaking their lines. Massacring their men and sacking his camp, Octavian, barely escaped with his life. But at the same time, on the other flank, the story was radically opposite. Mark Antony's veteran troops, more disciplined, destroyed Cassius's legions. Antony's attack was brutal, relentless. Cassius's camp was taken, his men slaughtered, the survivors in flight. 2 simultaneous battles with 2 opposite outcomes, and in between, the fog of war. Cassius had withdrawn to a hill to observe the battlefield. In the distance, he saw Brutus's camp taken, but he couldn't know it was Brutus's own men celebrating and looting. Then he saw a detachment of cavalry galloping toward him. They were Brutus's men coming to announce the victory. But in the dust and distance, Cassius believed it was the enemy cavalry. He thought Brutus had been defeated. He thought all was lost. The fog of war and the cloud of dust sentenced the man who had started it all. "Take this," he said to his freedman, handing him a dagger. "Free me from life." Pindarus obeyed. Cassius covered his face with his cloak and received the blow. He died at the hands of his own slave, using, according to legend, the same dagger with which he had stabbed Julius Caesar in the Senate. The final irony for a practical man defeated not by the enemy, but by a tragic illusion. Shortly after, Brutus's messengers arrived at the hill shouting news of his victory. They found only his commander's corpse. When Brutus arrived and saw his friend and brother-in-law's body, his spirit broke. He called him in tears, the last of the Romans. Cassius, the brain of the conspiracy, was dead. But Brutus, the soul of the movement, still lived. He commanded an army that was still formidable. For 3 weeks, the 2 sides watched each other, tension growing with each dawn. Brutus knew time was against him. His men were demoralized. Victory had turned to ash in his mouth, pressured by his own troops and tormented by Caesar's ghost. He made the decision that sealed his fate. He ordered a second and final attack. 3 weeks, 21 dawns in which the remnants of the Republic's greatest army and the embodiment of Caesar's vengeance eyed each other across a blood-soaked valley. His legionaries, many of them mercenaries, began to desert. His officers pressured him, demanding one last battle before the entire army dissolved. Brutus, the philosopher, the idealist, no longer had control. He was trapped by the current of events he himself had unleashed. The Second Battle of Philippi lacked the chaotic uncertainty of the first. It was a massacre. Brutus's legions charged with desperation, not conviction. They faced Antony and Octavian's veteran troops, hardened men, better commanded, fighting for victory, not to avoid defeat. The Republicans' lines bent, then broke. The retreat turned into a panicked flight. The dream of the Republic didn't die with a defiant cry, but with the sound of thousands of men running for their lives. Brutus managed to escape the battlefield with a handful of his most loyal officers. They hid in the nearby hills, listening to their enemies' victory shouts and the sound of Antony's cavalry combing the area, searching for him. The man who had ruled Rome for an instant was now a cornered fugitive in the darkness of a Greek forest. There in the cold night, Brutus knew it was all over. He looked at his friends and uttered words that revealed the fracture in his soul. He lamented that the virtue for which he had sacrificed everything might be nothing more than a hollow word, and that he had been a slave to fortune. The idealist crashed against the wall of reality. He had killed his friend and mentor for an idea, and that idea had just died before his eyes. He wouldn't allow himself to be captured. The humiliation of being dragged through Rome's streets in Octavian's triumphal parade was a fate worse than death. He asked one of his officers, Clytus, to kill him. Clytus refused, weeping. He asked another Dardanus, who also refused. Finally, he approached his friend Strato. He asked him to hold his sword with the point toward him. Strato, with tears in his eyes, obeyed. Brutus used his last strength to run and impale himself on the blade. He died instantly. The soul of the conspiracy was extinguished shortly after Samsi removed his costly purple general's cloak and covered his enemy's corpse. Later, he would say that Brutus was the noblest of all Romans, the only conspirator who acted for an ideal, not envy. Octavian didn't share that respect. When brought the news, his reaction was icy. He ordered Brutus's head to be cut off and sent to Rome to be thrown at the feet of Julius Caesar's statue. Octavian's vengeance knew no nobility, only total annihilation. The contrast between the two victors in that moment sowed the seeds of the war to come between them. Vengeance wasn't complete until every one of the 60 men who wielded a dagger that day was dead. The Great War was over. Now began the silent hunt, a purge that would extend to every corner of the Mediterranean. For the remaining assassins, hell was just beginning. After the Battle of Philippi, the power of the Roman world lay in the hands of 3 men, and one of them, Octavian, had an obsession, the list of the 60 men who had participated in his father's assassination. Brutus and Cassius were just the first 2 major names to be crossed off. Dozens remained. And now the triumvirs had armies, fleet spies, and a nearly limitless treasury to find them. There was no corner in the Mediterranean where they could hide. The amnesty had been a farce. Prescription was now the law. Gaius Trebonius, the man who had cleverly detained Mark Antony outside the Senate, while the others stabbed Caesar. He believed himself safe as governor of Asia. But a general loyal to Antony captured him, tortured him for days, seeking information, then beheaded him. His head was used as a ball by soldiers in the streets of Smyrna. He was one of the first to die a brutal warning of the kind of mercy they could expect. Decimus Junius Brutus, Albinus, not to be confused with Marcus Brutus. Decimus was one of Caesar's closest friends, one of his most brilliant generals. Caesar had named him in his will as secondary heir if Octavian didn't accept. It was he who on the morning of the Ides convinced a hesitant Caesar to go to the Senate. An intimate and devastating betrayal. After Philippi, his legions in Gaul abandoned him. Suddenly, the powerful general was a man alone. He tried to cross the Alps disguised as a Gallic chief. He sought refuge with a local chieftain he had once called a friend, but loyalty has a price. And Decimus Brutus's head was worth a fortune. The Gallic chief didn't hesitate. He murdered him in his own home and sent the head as a gift to Mark Antony. The friend who convinced Caesar to walk to his death was betrayed by a friend for the promise of gold. One by one they fell. Lucius Cassius, brother of the main conspirator, was killed on Octavian's order after the battle. Publius Casca, the first man to plunge his dagger into Caesar, fled Philippi like a ghost. Legend says he wandered the world tormented by guilt until he committed suicide in an unknown place. Or perhaps the sea claimed him in a storm. His death is a mystery. His body was never found, as if the earth itself refused to give him burial. The hunt lasted more than a decade, demonstrating Octavian's implacable memory. The last of the major assassins to die was Cassius Parmensis, a poet and writer who had put his pen in service of the Republic. After Philippi, his life was an odyssey of escapes. He joined the pirate Sextus Pompey in Sicily. When Pompey was defeated, he committed the most ironic act of all. He joined Mark Antony, the avenger of Caesar, united against Caesar's son. But he chose the losing side for the last time. After Antony's final defeat at the Battle of Actium, more than 14 years after the assassination, Octavian's men finally found him in Athens. He was dragged out and executed without ceremony. With his death, Octavian's list was finally almost complete. One by one, they fell in battles in dark alleys by their own hand or by a traitor's. None of Caesar's assassins died of old age. Most died violently, many with the same daggers they had used on the Ides of March, fulfilling a kind of poetic and terrible justice. But while vengeance was consummated, something else was happening. With every Republican senator who died, with every opponent silenced, one man's power grew until it became absolute. The assassins had stabbed Caesar to kill the idea of a king. In the vacuum they left, they had cultivated the birth of something far more powerful and enduring, an emperor. The final irony of their sacrifice had not yet been revealed in its full magnitude. When the last of the assassins was hunted and executed, a strange silence fell over the Roman world. For the first time in nearly 20 years, there was no active civil war. The purge was over. But the peace Octavian had brought was the peace of a graveyard. An entire generation of the Roman aristocracy, the men who had led the Senate and commanded the legions for centuries, was dead. Assassinated in the proscriptions fallen at Philippi, or purged in the subsequent wars. The triumvir's pact forged in the blood of their enemies couldn't last. With the world at their feet, the last two predators, Mark Antony and Octavian, turned on each other. It was a war of propaganda before it was a war of swords. Octavian from Rome painted Antony as a traitor, a Roman general enslaved by a foreign queen who wanted to rule Rome from Egypt. Antony from Alexandria saw Octavian as a tyrannical usurper, a greedy child clinging to power. The final clash came at sea in the Battle of Actium. It was the last convulsion of the dying republic. Octavian's victory was total. Mark Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt where, cornered and with no escape, they took their own lives. The general threw himself on his sword. The last challenge to Octavian's power vanished. Now he was alone, completely alone at the top. His father's assassins dead, the old Senate guard dead. His rivals Lepidus exiled, Antony dead. He had avenged Caesar in a way not even Julius Caesar himself could have imagined. He had absolute and undisputed power over an empire stretching from Spain to Syria. And here is where the final, most crushing irony of the story is revealed. The Liberators had stabbed Caesar because they feared he would crown himself king. They feared one man would destroy 500 years of Republican tradition. Their act, designed to save the Republic, was the catalyst that destroyed it completely. Octavian had learned his father's lesson. He didn't declare himself dictator for life. He didn't wear a crown. It was a brilliant farce. He maintained the appearances of the Republic, the consuls, the senators, the assemblies, but gradually and legally concentrated all real powers in himself. Control of the army, finances, the richest provinces. The Senate, grateful for peace, granted him a new name, Augustus, the Venerable. He became Rome's first emperor. He ruled with power more absolute than Caesar ever dreamed. And he did so for over 40 years. He died of old age in his bed, deified as a god. Brutus Cassius and the others had killed a man to stop it. The result of their sacrifice wasn't freedom, but the creation of an emperor and the birth of the Roman Empire. In the end, they didn't save the Republic. They only ensured that everyone who believed in it died, leaving the path clear for the new order. Their struggle for freedom was the stepping stone on which Augustus built his throne. The 23 stabbings on the Senate floor didn't prevent tyranny. They only chose the tyrant.